Welcome everyone, it's great to be speaking today. I'm Alison Woods and this is Daniela Cromer and we are partners in the CMS Employment Group. Well Danny, it'll be great this morning to talk about the guide to remote working that the Employment Group have produced. I know there's a lot of issues that we need to think about. I wondered if we could start just thinking about what has changed. This is an area that we've seen a lot of developments in. What do you think has changed in relation to remote working?
Well, you see, the history of remote working is quite interesting in the sense that it was largely not in the focus of anybody until COVID-19 hit. And then it became the thing of the hour. So everybody was working remotely. So we came from a situation which was unregulated to a situation which was very regulated because COVID-19 regulation pretty much forced everybody to work from home. And that has changed, thankfully, because COVID-19 is finally a thing of the past.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. And now we've seen remote working to become like a phenomenon in our working lives that has come to stay. But what we've also seen that is now countries have implemented legislation and that legislation is not as uniform as it was during COVID-19, but you see really cultural differences popping up for us as employment lawyers when it comes to, well, everything about remote working, how it's implemented, how it's changed, what about health and safety, what about costs, what about working from abroad. So we made this guide to show to our clients how vastly different these areas are regulated in each jurisdiction, because that information is vital if you want to implement a remote working policy.
I think that's one of the things that has really fascinated me in terms of putting the guide together and updating as we've gone along is for a subject which in some ways feels quite universal. It's just fascinating to see how different the situation is across a number of countries and how cultural differences as well have changed the way that governments have approached it and how much regulation is in place. So hopefully it's going to be useful to people as they get to grips with it. So I guess in terms of starting with sort of implementing remote work, what things have we been looking at in terms of the guide, in terms of businesses who are implementing that?
What you see, the cultural differences when implementing. So you see in some countries, it's really just about an agreement between employer and employee and everything is, subject to that agreement and can be changed that way. Then we see other countries with a very strong collaborative culture like the Netherlands, where for implementation and for change, you will need Works Council consent. And if you don't have that, well, yes, you can go to a court. But we've also learned that courts are a bit reluctant to bypass Works Council's disagreement. So you're very much dependent on the other party here. Whereas I think surprising to both of us, where some countries like Monaco, which have a public authority where you have to put forward your scheme and where you have to register each and every employee who's on remote working. So very, very different in terms of how you implement and also how you change. And what we've also seen, like in some countries, that remote working, well, there's also some consideration on remote working being able to reconcile work and family life. So we saw that in Spain under certain conditions that you can request remote working if you have care obligations for a child under 12 or for another person that requires this type of care. So very, very different here for employers to when they roll out or when they change the policies.
And I think that I know from having worked myself with a number of international businesses who've wanted to develop more policies around this. I mean, as you said, in many cases it was something which on a big scale businesses started out of necessity because of the pandemic. But I think that in the years since then, we've seen organisations want to put in place more structure, more rules around that. And I think culturally, businesses are very often looking to have a culture that goes across their organisation rather than thinking just about the culture within the countries that they're operating in. And I'm starting to see that create more challenges where the resistance around that and where the governance that's in place is so vastly different in some cases. And I think that one size fits all doesn't quite apply in exactly the same way. So it's throwing up some interesting challenges that we pick up in terms of the guide.
Yes, and it's also, I think what is safe to say that at least if you want the uniform approach, at least it takes time to consider all these national differences. I mean, another area we haven't talked about yet is also health and safety, because while people are working in the office, it's very obvious that the employer in one way or another is responsible for health and safety and also for working time, etc. But when you work remotely, the health and safety obligations are very different in various jurisdictions. So in some jurisdictions, employers remain responsible for health and safety at home, have to provide ergonomic setup or whatever. In other countries, so like where I come from, you just have to hand employees information on how to do the ergonomic setup of their working place at home. So that is very different. Also, in terms of, how responsible are you as an employer for working time violations when people work at home? You might have a more loose setup there. We learned that in Brazil, collective bargaining agreements may even, exclude people who work remotely from working time schemes, which, if you think it through, then they wouldn't even be entitled to overtime. So to put it short, you need to consider all these things when you try to implement or change remote working policy, and just to have this setup, and to comply with all the laws, it just takes time and careful consideration to implement and to be compliant all over the globe.
Yeah, it does. And you mentioned change there, because I think that there was that first step of people putting in place, if the office was everyone's traditional place of work and we moved to people working from home, I think one of the trends we're undoubtedly seeing as we've updated the guide has been this move towards a lot of businesses being keen to get people back into the office. And it's been really interesting seeing some of the different challenges that come up in terms of trying to make that shift where people have become used to that independence. I think people have now developed their lives in a way which very often necessitates them being able to work remotely. And of course, we're also seeing, I think, through some of the commentary that there are discrimination issues around that. Very often we're seeing that it's women or people with childcare responsibilities who've maybe organised their lives in a way which means they need some of those arrangements. And so that shift for businesses to try and say to everyone that actually we would like you to come back to the office creates some real difficulties in some cases for those employees, but also for the businesses. I think looking at the range of input from the countries, what was very interesting was getting in or out of those arrangements is as complicated as trying to get them in place to begin with, and seeing that in some cases, I think in the Netherlands, if you cannot agree that with the Works Council, you're going to have to go to court to try and change that arrangement, and that's going to be a really difficult thing to do and a process that's going to be quite daunting. I would imagine where Works Councils may be well set up to want to support the arrangements that have been in place now. So really interesting things that we're seeing there.
I mean, it boils down a bit towards costs, right? Mm-hmm. So the cost of living, so you might set up living more further out because you don't have to commute so often. The cost of the commute, in some cases the cost of living because you just got yourself a bigger house because you have a room to work from, can also be the cost for the office spaces if you reduced office spaces. So all these choices have a huge financial impact. And you mentioned that this tendency to get people back into the office. When we looked at the contributions, we also found that the opposite. So companies that basically put everybody on remote work, and in, say, Belgium now struggle with employees being able to request to go back to the office, even though there is no office space anymore. So there's a huge, like various situations that come up balancing these different type of interest, and that's quite, well, for us it's interesting. For clients it can be rather challenging at times. And I think one issue that is also part of this is you can work remotely, not just in the outskirts of London or Vienna, but you can also go to another country, because technology really does not know any borders or hardly any borders, so you can dial in from anywhere. But legally that can, of course...
We've certainly seen a lot of issues coming up with that. So yes, it's good that we have lots of friendly people who can support us with immigration and tax within CMS, because I've certainly personally dealt with a lot of issues for clients around that, with the ease of forgetting that there are borders, as you say. And I think that that reality in terms of people going off and working somewhere, depending on the role that they're in, it really can create some quite complex issues around insurance coverage, around taxation for them, potentially taxation for the business as well. So the structure that we're seeing clients want to put in place, I mean, in some cases, I think actually I've seen clients see it as a benefit to be able to provide some level of work from anywhere, even if that's for a short time each year. I think that that's something that we know that businesses want to attract top talent, and a way of doing that, we shouldn't forget that the way in which we work, I think, is something that is a highly valued aspect of people's enjoyment of their work. So I know that clients are thinking about that as well, but it's those issues that can inadvertently create these problems for clients that they do need to think about. And I think just taking the time to review where you are, to actually make sure that you're auditing those arrangements in practice, can really avoid some of those tricky issues going forward. But I was interested when you were talking about the cost issue, because we've certainly seen that, and I think that clients who've moved to hot desking, smaller offices, to make sure that they can minimise their costs if people aren't coming in. One of the issues I know in the UK that we've seen as well is an impact in terms of people who are potentially neurodiverse or have other disabilities, because I think that the need to make accommodations for those people, the need to make the workplace an inclusive one, it's quite interesting, I'm finding, in terms of how you combine those things. This idea that people can just turn up and work at any desk and get on with their day isn't always true if you have got additional needs, if you need support around that. So I think that in those policies and in thinking about some of the issues that come up, it's also about thinking about everyone within the workforce and the obligations that you have to them and what you need to think about there. So that's certainly been an area where it's given some pause for thought, just in terms of making reasonable adjustments, thinking about ways in which the modern workplace can still be welcoming, whether that's having quieter areas, or maybe someone does need an assigned desk or something like that, if you're doing that hot desking. But I think there are other sort of risks around equality and diversity as well. You know, you mentioned earlier talking about women and people sort of working away from the workplace as well. We've certainly seen things there.
Yes, it's really quite a careful balance, right? Do you allow remote work thinking, and in practice really making it easier for people with caring responsibilities, which, to be honest, are mostly women, to participate in the workplace, to have your work larger number of hours, etc., have a better income, better pension, whatever. But by not inviting them back into the office, you do, at least in some cases, exclude them from career opportunities, because in all honesty, it's a lot about human connection, chit-chat over coffees, to see opportunities, career opportunities, advancing, etc. So what you would have to be careful about is not to create an environment where you just, leave women with career responsibilities basically out of that space of opportunity. So these are all things to bear in mind when drafting a policy. And I think what we can say is that a lot of issues, be it the gender balance, be it inclusion, be it working from abroad, can be dealt with in a good manner if you think about them ahead, if you plan them, because the biggest issues that we see is if those issues are not addressed in advance, and you, for example, discover people working from the other end of the world, and all of a sudden you have a tax problem there, or you didn't think it through and you have an office space full of men, for example, which is not bad per se, but it's just saying that if you want to have an equal opportunity working space, that's maybe not what you want to have.
I remember someone saying to me in the pandemic, the idea that workplaces would become men dens. And I don't think we're quite there. But I do think it's a difficult issue in the sense that in so many ways, this thing has been a gift to people in terms of inclusion, in the sense of it's potentially allowed the flexible working, the agility to work in different places, I think allows people to stay in the workforce where they might not otherwise have stayed with particular employers or in certain roles. And so it's not something which is one-sided, I think, is the challenge. But also I know that in terms of thinking about remote working, or in terms of thinking about getting people back to the office and touching on some of the topics that we asked all of our countries about, clients are having to think about how do you manage those conversations? How do you engage with people in a way which is positive, which is on the right side of the law, in terms of having the right motives for getting people back into the office if that's what you're wanting to do, or supporting remote working, or doing that in a way which doesn't indirectly negatively impact a particular group. And I think, as you say, allowing the time for that, because the planning around these things is not something in our experience, I think, which you would say you can just change overnight. You need to take that time to engage with the right groups, to think about the impact, not just on the main group, but others who are also working for you. And I think the good thing is we've got some real success stories in terms of how businesses are doing that well, but also that isn't something that they've achieved by accident. It's something that we've seen through a lot of work going into it.
Well, thank you, Alison. This has been really super interesting for me, and hopefully also for our clients. And particularly, we hope that our expert guide on remote working, which allows comparing the situation in various countries, assists with planning of good and successful remote working policies.
Thank you.